My son actually thought he could wipe out my 40 years of blood, sweat, and tears with a single automated email. He told me I was out. He told me I was obsolete. The kid had absolutely no idea that while he was popping champagne to celebrate forcing me into retirement, I was quietly hitting enter on a keyboard, completely shattering his fragile, vanity-filled world. By sunrise the next day, he had called me 55 times. I didn't answer a single one. My name is Arthur Sterling. Back in the day, right here in Chicago, I built a Midwestern logistics empire from nothing but a beat-up used truck and a high-interest loan that was practically criminal. I raised my son to be a leader, but he chose to become a corporate thief. Before I tell you how a father takes back everything that belongs to him, let me know in the comments if you've ever been betrayed by someone you would have given your life for. And if you believe loyalty is the only currency that matters, hit that like button and subscribe. The December Illinois wind was cutting through the Gary truck stop like a razor blade, and the temperature was sitting at 10 below zero. I'm 70 years old, and I'm the founder of Sterling Freight. My net worth is the kind of number people only whisper about at country clubs. Yet, at 2 in the afternoon, I was lying flat on my back under the chassis of an 18-wheeler, checking the anti-freeze valves on the air brake lines. I don't trust anyone else to understand the critical difference between getting a job done and getting it done perfectly. My old dispatch manager, Hank, a Vietnam vet who's been with me for 30 years, tried to hand me a cup of hot coffee, but I just waved it off. I needed to feel that biting cold. It reminded me that I was still alive, still sharp, and still the hardest working man in the Great Lakes region. The phone inside my heavy canvas work jacket started buzzing. It was a sharp, continuous vibration that cut right through the roar of the diesel engines around me. I pulled it out, expecting a blizzard warning or maybe a notification about a delayed supplier. The sender was Julian, my son, my only child. The boy I paid to send to an Ivy League school for a master's degree in supply chain management. The boy wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my own father made in a year. The email was short, and every single word was designed to cut deep. The board meeting has just concluded. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties as chairman. The company is transitioning fully to an AI-driven, asset-light strategy. The vote was unanimous. Elise has already arranged for movers to clear out your penthouse office. Please do not return to headquarters. We are taking the company into a new era without you. I stared at the screen. The cold wind rushed down my collar, but my blood went completely freezing cold. There was no apology, no explanation, just a cold, calculated dismissal, straight out of a Silicon Valley tech playbook. He didn't even have the courage to look me in the eye or the decency to hear my voice. I crawled out from under the truck, brushed off the grease and snow, and looked out at the distant Chicago skyline. I saw the massive distribution center we bought back in 2002. I saw the cold storage warehouses we built in 2010. Every single interstate running through this city has the tire tracks of my fleet written all over it. And now, this boy, who would get sick just looking at a spare tire, was telling me I was finished. Hank looked at me, his weathered face filled with concern. He asked if something was wrong. I put the phone back in my pocket and told him everything was fine. I lied. I walked to my 2005 Ford F250 pickup truck, feeling incredibly calm, so calm it almost scared me. I didn't scream, and I didn't throw my phone. Anyone who has ever built a logistics network knows that if you want to paralyze the supply chain, you don't need to destroy the trucks. You just have to cut off the nerve center. I drove home. I didn't go to Julian's $4 million penthouse on Chicago's Gold Coast. That was the wedding gift I bought for him and Elise when they got married. I was the one paying their steep property taxes and building maintenance fees. Instead, I drove straight back to my house in Oak Park, the solid, modest brick home my late wife and I bought 30 years ago. The house was dead silent, save for the low, steady hum of the heating system. I walked into my study, shut the door, and sat down at the heavy oak desk. This was the exact spot where I spent countless nights teaching Julian how to read freight routing maps and where I signed the checks for his expensive tuition. I powered on my computer, Julian might be an Ivy League graduate who understands terms like algorithm optimization and asset restructuring, and he knows how to pitch tech investors in a temperature-controlled boardroom. But Julian didn't know how my underlying financial architecture was built. He thought that by becoming the official head of the company, he controlled the money. He was dead wrong. I logged into the back end of our corporate banking system. I didn't use the regular user interface the finance department deals with every day. I used the Master Administrator portal. I had set up that digital master key back in the late 90s when the company first started digitizing its operations. It was a safety switch I hoped I'd never have to use, originally designed to protect us from hackers or hostile corporate takeovers. And today, the hostile threat trying to strip my company away was my own flesh and blood. I checked the balances. The operating account held $20 million. The fleet fuel credit cards were fully loaded. The investment accounts were performing beautifully. Julian and Elise were planning to use that money to rebrand the company, wanting to erase the Sterling name entirely and replace it with some trendy name that sounded like a tech startup. Elise had even complained privately at a party that my legacy smelled like diesel fuel and needed to be completely washed away. I didn't hesitate. My hand was perfectly steady. I clicked on the operating account and selected the option to freeze all major outgoing transactions pending an internal audit. I set the system so that any expense over $200 required physical security, key verification from the original founder. Next, I moved over to the credit card management screen. Julian had a corporate Amex Black card, and Elise had a secondary card that she treated entirely as her personal ATM. I pulled up the transaction history, and it was an unsettling display of pure greed. $10,000 for a luxury handbag, a $3,000 bill at a high-end French restaurant, and even $1,500 for a purebred dog spa treatment. They were draining the company's resources while publicly claiming I was the bottleneck holding things back. I clicked Report, Lost or Stolen, and Deactivate. The screen flashed a confirmation message showing the status as canceled. I leaned back in my leather chair, and the silence in the room felt incredibly heavy. I felt a real ache in my chest, right where the pride I used to have for my son finally died. But then I remembered that email. Please do not return to headquarters. Those words hardened my resolve like quick-drying concrete. I wasn't doing this out of petty revenge. I was about to teach them the first rule of logistics. Never burn down the bridge that keeps you fed. On the other side of the city, the first domino was about to fall. I knew Elise's schedule better than she did because I paid the bills. Today was Tuesday, and Tuesday was her night for the high-end charity auction gala at the Peninsula Hotel downtown. It was a place where socialites gathered to sip champagne and pretend to care about global causes. I could picture the scene perfectly. Elise would be wearing an expensive designer gown, her skin glowing, handing over that heavy black card with complete indifference, using her perfectly manicured hand. She would be staring at her phone screen, probably looking at the likes on a fake post she just made about Sterling Freight, embracing a new corporate era. The coordinator would swipe the card on the wireless terminal. The machine would beep, making that sharp, dull sound indicating an electronic rejection. The coordinator would try it again, then offer that tight, apologetic professional smile, letting her know there seemed to be an issue. Elise would scoff. She'd say that was impossible. She'd ask if they knew who she was and tell them to run it again. They would run it again. Transaction declined. Account flagged, please confiscate card. Elise's heavily made-up face would instantly flush bright red, clashing completely with her diamond necklace. She would be forced to open her expensive handbag, digging around for her own personal debit card, an account that wasn't funded by my money. That card was very likely empty because every single dollar she touched was spent immediately. I poured myself a glass of neat bourbon and took a slow sip. The sharp burn was deeply satisfying, keeping me grounded. The phone screen on my desk lit up. It was the first time in hours. The name flashing on the screen was Julian. Elise had definitely called him, undoubtedly screaming through the phone, demanding to know why she had just been humiliated in front of Chicago's elite. And Julian with his signature arrogance, probably told her it was just a system glitch and that he could fix it with a quick call to the bank. He had probably called the bank 5 minutes ago, and the bank likely told him he didn't have the security clearance to override a top-level security freeze initiated by the master administrator. I watched the phone vibrate. I watched his face pop up on the screen, a photo I took at his university graduation. He looked so proud back then, so full of potential. Now he was just a corporate climber who didn't understand the law of gravity. I didn't reach for the phone. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Immediately, it started ringing again. He was starting to realize the doors were locked. He was starting to realize the engine had cut out. He was starting to realize that the old man he had kicked to the curb was the only one holding the keys. I took another sip of bourbon. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the room. The dark was setting in, but for the first time all day, I smiled. Let them call. Let them panic. This lesson was just getting started. The next morning, Chicago brought the kind of bright winter day that was completely deceiving. The sky was a sharp blue, but the wind remained brutal. I sat in my home office with a fresh pot of black coffee, facing 6 monitors displaying real-time security footage from the Sterling Freight headquarters. I built that building 15 years ago. I knew every bolt in the steel framework and every inch of network cable in the walls. I designed the main entrance to look imposing, a testament to how we forced our way into an industry that once tried to shut us out. Today, that very entrance was going to be the stage for a reckoning my own son brought upon himself. At exactly 9 in the morning, a luxury vehicle pulled up to the curb. Leading the way was the black Tesla model S Plaid the company leased for the CEO. Julian stepped out of the driver's seat, looking like a man who had just conquered the corporate world. He was wearing a $5,000 tailored navy wool suit, his Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He adjusted his silk tie, checking his reflection in the car window. He certainly looked like a modern corporate executive, looking like money from head to toe, but he absolutely didn't look like someone who knew how to change the oil on a heavy truck. Out of the passenger seat stepped Elise. She was wearing a flawless white power suit, and she kept her designer sunglasses firmly on, even though the towering building cast a massive shadow over the sidewalk. She carried a brand-name briefcase, but I knew for a fact it was completely empty because she didn't do a single shred of actual work for the company. She was only there to manage appearances, to smile at investors, and to play the part of the queen of an empire she had absolutely no hand in building. Right behind them were 3 men in dark gray overcoats. They were the heavy hitters from Redwood Venture Capital, a powerhouse firm out of Silicon Valley. Julian had been wining and dining them for 6 solid months. He had promised them that Sterling Freight was ready to liquidate its entire physical fleet and pivot into a pure algorithm-driven logistics brokerage platform. He called it a disruptive paradigm shift. I called it a pipe dream. I leaned closer to my leather chair and turned up the volume on the surveillance monitors. The microphones at the front desk were top of the line. I could hear the crisp snap of their leather shoes hitting the concrete, and I could hear the absolute arrogance in Julian's voice as he gestured toward the glass facade of the building. "Gentlemen, welcome to the future of Sterling Logistics Tech," Julian said, his voice smooth and heavily rehearsed, sounding just like a motivational speaker. "We are shedding the outdated shell of a traditional trucking company. What you see before you is the nerve center of a global infrastructure tech brand. The previous leadership was obsessed with trucks and diesel fuel, but my focus is entirely on data and cloud integration. Follow me." He marched toward the revolving glass doors with the stride of a king reclaiming his castle. The Silicon Valley investors nodded politely. They were numbers guys, ruthlessly focused on efficiency and returns. They didn't care about trendy buzzwords. They cared about profit margins. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his security access card. It was a platinum-level badge that gave him entry to every single floor, every server room, and every secure vault in the building. At least it used to. He walked up to the scanner on the steel column next to the door and gave it a confident flick of his wrist, expecting the familiar beep and a green light. Instead, a harsh electronic rejection tone echoed across the entrance, and a bright red light flashed on the panel. The heavy glass doors didn't budge. Julian frowned. He looked at the card, wiped it on his sleeve, assuming it was just a smudge or some dust, and tried again. Another sharp rejection tone and another red light. Access denied. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the pleasant bitterness on my tongue. I watched the confusion wash over his face, a tiny fracture in his perfect corporate mask. Elise stepped up beside him, her smile stiffening. "What is going on, Julian?" she muttered through clenched teeth, keeping her voice low so the investors wouldn't hear. "Open the door. The wind is brutal out here." "Just a minor glitch," Julian forced a laugh, turning back to the investors. "Apologies, gentlemen. We just upgraded our highest level security protocols this morning. High-tech systems can be a bit sensitive sometimes. Give me one moment." He swiped the card again, harder this time, as if physical force could somehow override digital code. The result was exactly the same, the red light flashing away, mercilessly mocking him. Inside the lobby, sitting behind the massive granite front desk, was Hank. He's 65, a military veteran who lost 2 fingers in combat. Nobody would hire him back then, so I gave him a job. Hank wasn't just a security guard, he was the gatekeeper. He knew every employee's name, whose wife was sick and whose kid was graduating. He respected authority, but he respected character a whole lot more. Julian pressed his face against the glass, waving frantically at Hank. Hank slowly looked up from his morning newspaper, taking off his reading glasses. He didn't rush, and he didn't snap to attention. He stood up with the unbothered pace of an older man who had seen actual combat and wasn't about to be intimidated by a kid in a suit. Hank walked right up to the glass door, standing just inches away from Julian on the other side. "Open the door!" Julian shouted. His voice was muffled by the thick security glass, but the desperation was clear. "The system is down. Let us in. I have VIP clients out here." Hank didn't reach for the override switch, and he didn't unlock the gate. Instead, he reached into his uniform chest pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it with agonizing precision and pressed it flat against the glass, holding it right at Julian's eye level so he could read every single word. It was a legal document printed on heavy bond paper, bearing the official stamp of the Cook County Court. At the very top, in bold black letters, it read, "Lease termination and notice to vacate." Julian stared at the paper, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. I could see his lips moving. I knew exactly what he was reading because I had personally dictated those terms to my old attorney, Rousseau, at 3 o'clock in the morning. The document made it explicitly clear that the building at 400 Commercial Avenue was the sole personal property of Arthur Sterling. The corporate entity known as Sterling Freight was merely a tenant. The notice stated that due to a violation of moral clauses and a failure to pay a newly updated massive security deposit, the lease was terminated immediately. All tenant employees were strictly barred from entering until further notice. Julian took a sharp step back, looking as if the paper had physically burned him. He glared at Hank. "Hank, open this door right now!" Julian screamed, his composure completely shattering, the motivational speaker entirely gone. He was just a spoiled kid hearing the word no for the very first time in his life. "I am the CEO of this company. I pay your salary. Open the door or you're fired. Do you hear me? Fired." Hank leaned in close to the glass, his lips moving. I couldn't hear him through the feed, but I knew Hank too well not to know what he said. He undoubtedly told him, "Kid, you don't pay my salary. Your father does." Then Hank simply turned his back on them. He walked straight back to the front desk, sat down, and picked up his newspaper again. The finality of it was brutal. It was pure, unadulterated dismissal. Julian stood there, his hand frozen in midair, his mouth slightly open. Elise was tearing at his arm, her long nails digging deep into his expensive suit jacket. Her face was bright red from a mix of fury and intense embarrassment. She looked around frantically, checking to see if anyone was watching. Everyone was watching. Employees arriving for work were gathering on the sidewalk, whispering to one another. Passers-by were stopping to look. The Silicon Valley venture capitalists exchanged a look. It was a look of pure professional contempt. The lead partner, a tall man named Stephen, checked his expensive watch, looked at the locked doors, and then looked at the sweating, screaming man who had called himself an industry visionary. "Mr. Sterling," Stephen spoke, his voice cold and clipped, "it appears there is a massive canyon between your presentation and your reality. You promised us a seamless transition of power and a stable foundation. We see neither." "Wait!" Julian stammered, spinning around, sweat breaking out across his forehead. "This is just a misunderstanding. My father is suffering from age-related confusion, and he's trying to sabotage my plans. I'm calling the police. We'll have this sorted out in 10 minutes. Gentlemen, please, let's step into the cafe next door and discuss the portfolio details." "We don't do business on the sidewalk, Julian," Stephen cut him off. "And we certainly don't invest in a firm that can't even open its own front doors. We are officially withdrawing our letter of intent. Please do not contact us again." The three investors gave a sharp nod in unison and turned on their heels. Without looking back, they hailed a premium black car and vanished into the morning traffic. And just like that, they took with them the $20 million in capital that Julian desperately needed to keep the company afloat and fund his transition. Julian watched them drive away, his shoulders slumping as if all the air had been sucked right out of him. He turned to Elise, and she slapped his arm hard. "Do something!" she shrieked. "Fix this! I'm not standing out here in the freezing cold like a beggar." Julian pulled out his phone, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the pavement. He hit speed dial number 1. On my desk, my phone lit up, vibrating against the heavy oak wood. His name flashed across the screen. I watched it ring. I didn't move a finger, letting it roll straight to voicemail. He called back immediately. I could picture him standing on that freezing concrete, the wind picking up, locked out of the heat, locked out of the facilities, and locked completely out of his power. The phone rang a third time, then a fourth. I took a bite of my whole wheat toast, chewing slowly. By the 10th call, I could imagine the sheer panic setting in. He was starting to realize this wasn't a game. He was starting to realize that this building wasn't just a pile of concrete and steel. It was the ultimate leverage. He tried to steal the company, but he forgot that the company lived in a house that I owned. By the 15th call, Elise was undoubtedly screaming into his other ear. She would be blaming him, demanding to know what happened to her canceled black card, and asking why the bank had humiliated her. The pressure cooker was beginning to crack. By the 20th call, reality had finally settled in. He wasn't a king. He was just a trespasser. I took one last look at the surveillance feed. Julian was furiously kicking the reinforced glass door, screaming into the empty lobby. Inside, Hank didn't even look up from his paper. I reached out and flipped the power switch on the surveillance hub. The screens went pitch black. I'd seen enough. The first wall of his defense had crumbled. Now it was time to tear down the rest of his fortress. I picked up my phone, not to answer his desperate calls, but to call my attorney. It was time to initiate Phase 2. This war to protect my life's work was only just beginning. The vibration against my oak desk never stopped. But this time, it wasn't the ringtone of a phone call. It was a relentless cascade of app notifications, buzzing like a swarm of angry hornets. I picked up the device and saw that I was being tagged in a live broadcast link. The account belonged to Elise. The caption read, "The truth about Sterling Freight, breaking the silence." I didn't want to watch it. I wanted to hurl the phone straight into Lake Michigan behind my house. But in a war, you have to scout the enemy's position. You have to see exactly where they are pointing their weapon before you strip it away from them. I tapped the screen. Elise appeared, sitting in the guest room of the Gold Coast penthouse I had bought for them. The lighting was soft, perfectly arranged to make her look like a suffering angel. She wasn't wearing her usual heavy makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a casual, messy bun, and she wore a simple gray t-shirt. She looked exhausted, fragile. It was a flawless victim disguise. 她从眼角抹去一滴眼泪，直直地撑着手机镜头，她的声音在颤抖。"Hi, everyone," she began, her voice trembling. "I really didn't want to do this. I truly didn't. But I can't stay silent anymore. You all saw what happened this morning at headquarters. You saw my husband, Julian, trying so hard to lead this company into the future and create new technology jobs. And then you saw him ruthlessly locked out by a man who simply refuses to let go of control. She took a deep, shaky breath, looking down at her hands. The performance was Oscar-worthy. Arthur Sterling is a legend, we all know that, but he isn't the man he used to be. This past year, he's been struggling. His memory is failing, and he's become incredibly paranoid and hostile. We tried to give him a dignified retirement. We offered him a generous golden parachute package because we just wanted him to rest. But he refused. He thinks he's the only one who matters. Right now, he's holding the entire company hostage. He's hurting the employees, and he's hurting his own son. It breaks my heart to see Julian like this. Julian just wants to modernize while his father is stuck in the past. This is abuse. It's pure financial and emotional cruelty from a man who has lost touch with reality. I watched the live counter tick upward. 5,000 viewers. 10,000. The comments were scrolling so fast they became a blur of unadulterated hostility. Boycott Arthur Sterling! Classic toxic controlling patriarch. Save the company, back Julian. Put that old lunatic in a home. I read those comments, and every single one felt like a dagger. These people didn't know me. They didn't know that during a blizzard at 20 below zero, I was always the first one at an accident scene helping my drivers salvage the freight. They didn't know that I silently paid the college tuition for the kids of several drivers who passed away from illness over the years. They didn't know the dark, soul-crushing desperation I survived to build this company when corporate monopolies tried to bury me. All they saw was a crying blonde woman and a young, handsome CEO. To them, I was just a bitter, greedy old villain. Elise continued her performance, sniffing and looking up with wide, pleading eyes. Please, she said, if you believe in progress, if you believe in the future, stand with us. Support Julian. Don't let one man's extreme selfishness destroy the livelihoods of hundreds of families. We are fighting for you. We love you all. The video ended. I set the phone down. My hands were shaking, not out of fear, but out of absolute fury. It was a cold, hard anger that sat in my stomach like a heavy stone. She had played the victim card, and she had weaponized my age. She didn't just claim I was confused. She insinuated I was mentally unstable. I stood up and buttoned my heavy coat. I didn't go online to argue with keyboard warriors. I didn't write a rebuttal, and I didn't record a response video. I walked out to the garage and got into my pickup truck. I had a meeting to attend, and it wasn't with a crisis public relations expert. It was with a true legal shark. 40 minutes later, I walked into Paul Russo's law firm. Russo and I go back 30 years. We're an odd pairing, a rugged guy who came up from under a truck chassis, and a short, stout Italian lawyer, wearing glasses as thick as beer bottles. But Russo is the only attorney in all of Chicago I would trust with my life. He doesn't care about public opinion. He only cares about legal codes and contractual text. I sat on the leather sofa across from his desk. The office smelled of old paper and cigars. Russo didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had already watched the live stream. A tablet sat on his desk, paused on the frame of Elise pretending to wipe away a tear. "They're playing dirty, Arthur," Russo said, his voice raspy and calm. "A defamation lawsuit takes years, and you don't have years to spend in court. The court of public opinion moves much faster than a judge. If we sue her for slander right now, you immediately play right into the stereotype of a wealthy tyrant bullying a vulnerable woman. We lose that optics battle." I nodded. "I know. I have no intention of suing her over her words. I'm going to cut off their oxygen entirely." Russo smiled, a sharp, cold expression. "Then let's not attack the lies. Let's attack the facts." "What does Julian need right now more than anything besides money?" I asked. "Credibility," Russo replied. He stood up, walked over to a filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder. "And where does his credibility come from? From the name on the building, from the history of the company, and from your endorsement." He slammed the folder onto the desk. "Julian thinks he took over the company through a boardroom coup," Russo continued, "but he clearly didn't read the fine print from our 1998 restructuring." Sterling Logistics Operations, LLC, is the operating entity, but the intellectual property, the trademarks, the logo, and the brand name, Sterling Freight itself, belong to a completely separate holding company. Do you know who the sole owner of that holding company is? I looked at him. I do? It's you, Russo said. You merely license the name to the operating company. It's a revocable license agreement. The licensor can pull it at any time without cause. I leaned forward, the anger in my stomach finally shifting into a cold, deep satisfaction. So I can take my name back? Russo pulled a gold fountain pen from his pocket. You can strip them bare, Arthur. You can issue a cease and desist order immediately. They won't be allowed to use the name Sterling. They can't print the logo on stationery. They can't use the current corporate website, and they can't even answer the phones claiming to be Sterling Freight. Without that name and the history attached to it, what are they? They're just two strangers with massive personal debts and zero commercial history, I said quietly. Exactly. Russo pushed a document toward me. Sign here. I signed my name. The ink was black and permanent. With that signature, I wasn't just fighting a corporate battle. I was erasing their professional identity entirely. Elise wanted to talk about the future? Perfect. She could go embrace a future that didn't carry my name and couldn't pay for her lifestyle anymore. Even as the ink was drying on the paper, the second wave of my counterstrike was hitting its target with full force. On the other side of the city, Julian was sitting in a high-end boutique coffee shop, desperately trying to salvage the morning's disaster. He was on the phone with the vice president of commercial lending at First Commercial Bank of Chicago. I knew this because a security alert had just popped up on my phone, showing that the bank had run a pull on my personal credit file. I knew exactly what was happening. Julian was backed into a corner. The venture capitalist had walked away, and he desperately needed the $20 million bridge credit line that had been pre-approved the previous week. He needed that money to make payroll, to pay the diesel suppliers, and to cover the lease on the very Tesla he was driving. I could picture the conversation perfectly. Julian would be using his best corporate presentation voice. He would claim the security glitch at headquarters was temporary, brag about the massive public sympathy from the viral video, and insist the company was stronger than ever. The banker, Mr. Henderson, was listening. Henderson was a pure numbers guy. He didn't care about video views or social media trends. He cared about collateral and risk mitigation. Mr. Sterling, Henderson would say, his voice dry and professional, we have reevaluated the status of this loan facility. When the board approved that $20 million line, it was strictly based on the personal, unlimited guarantee of Arthur Sterling. It was backed by his hard assets, his 40 years of flawless credit, and his role as the primary controller of the business. Julian would interrupt him. But I'm the CEO now. I have an MBA. The board voted me in. The borrower is the corporation, not my father. Technically, that's true, Henderson would counter. However, the covenants of the loan agreement are very clear. Section 4, Clause B explicitly states that any material change in executive management requires a full reassessment of the credit line. Furthermore, the removal of Arthur Sterling constitutes a material adverse event. Without his personal guarantee, the risk profile of Sterling Freight exceeds our tolerance parameters. Julian would begin to sweat, realizing the ground beneath him was giving way. But we have contracts. We have accounts receivable. Those receivables are based on long-term corporate shipping accounts. We also just received a severe legal notice regarding a trademark and branding dispute. Henderson would deliver the final blow. If you cannot legally use the commercial name Sterling, you are, for all intents and purposes, representing a new entity with no track record. The line would go completely dead, filling with a suffocating silence. Therefore, Henderson will coldly deliver the final verdict. We are officially rescinding the loan offer. The $20 million credit line is canceled effective immediately. Furthermore, pending a full resolution of this leadership dispute, we are placing a hold on your corporation's current overdraft protection accounts. We strongly advise you to deposit sufficient funds within the next 24 hours to cover any outstanding checks you've already issued. Good luck, Mr. Sterling. The line will go dead. I sat in Russo's office, staring at the document I had just signed. I didn't feel a single ounce of joy. I only felt a heavy sense of necessity. I had just personally cut off the oxygen to the empire I built with my own hands. I had just made sure that by tomorrow morning my son wouldn't be able to access a single penny. Russo looked at me. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a crystal glass and slid it across the desk. "To tough love," he said quietly. I picked up the glass. I didn't toast to love. I toasted to survival. "To the truth," I replied. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Julian. "Dad, call the bank. Please, they've made a mistake." I stared at the message. He still didn't get it. He honestly thought this was some kind of internal bank error. He thought it was a glitch. He couldn't comprehend that his own boundless, reckless ambition had finally backfired on him. I typed out my reply, my fingers perfectly steady. "You wanted the company, you got it. But you don't get my name, and you sure as hell don't get my credit. You're on your own now, Mr. CEO. I hit send. This war was no longer about a building or a title. It was about cold, hard reality. And reality was about to hit Julian and Elise like a runaway freight truck. They might have the temporary sympathy of strangers on the internet, but sympathy doesn't pay a massive electricity bill. By tomorrow, the lights in their world would go completely dark. I stood up and shook Russo's hand. I had one more stop to make. Elise had claimed in her video that I was hurting the employees. She lied, and I was about to prove it in a way she could never spin on social media. I walked out of the law firm and into the bright afternoon sun. The real work was just beginning. Let them try to control the internet. I control the streets. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10. Each heavy chime echoed through the silent house. I sat in my leather armchair with the lights turned off, watching 2 headlight beams pierce the darkness of my driveway. I recognized the sound of the electric motor. It was the Tesla, but its current pace carried none of the arrogance or aggression of a young CEO. It crawled along the asphalt slowly and quietly, looking almost like a hearse. Julian and Elise had arrived at my house. I didn't get up to open the door. I waited until the doorbell rang. It rang twice, sounding hesitant and polite. I walked over and opened the door. The winter night air was freezing, but the moment I saw their faces, the temperature on my porch felt like it dropped another 10 degrees. They were no longer the 2 people who had been screaming at the old security guard this morning. They had pulled off an unsettling transformation. Julian had traded his $5,000 suit for a soft cashmere sweater and jeans, looking like a college student home for the holidays. Elise had washed away the tired look from her video, wearing a simple dark maxi dress and flats. She held a bottle of wine in her hand, presenting it like a peace offering. "Hey, Dad," Julian said, his voice incredibly soft. It was the exact tone he used when he was 10 years old and came to apologize for breaking a neighbor's window with a baseball. "Can we come in? We just really want to talk." I stepped aside. I didn't say a single word, letting them walk into the house they had planned to sell behind my back. Elise walked over to the kitchen island and set the wine down. It was a Cabernet. I recognized the label. It was a cheap $15 bottle from the grocery store. It was an insult. They knew perfectly well that I had a cellar filled with top-tier aged Bordeaux, but they brought this because, deep down, they still viewed me as nothing but a rugged truck driver who got lucky. They thought I couldn't tell the difference between fine wine and cheap juice. "I'm so incredibly sorry about today," Elise said. She stepped toward me with open arms, giving me a hug. Her posture was completely stiff, radiating a mix of expensive perfume and undeniable desperation. "We were just under so much pressure. The business, the stress. We lost our minds. You know how much we love you, right?" I stood there like a statue. I didn't hug her back. I just let her finish her performance. Julian walked over, putting his hand on my shoulder and giving it a firm squeeze. "Look, Dad," he said, "we made a mistake. A massive mistake. We never should have tried to push you out. We were just terrified. The market is shifting so fast, and we thought we had to transform immediately. But the truth is, we need you. We need your wisdom." I looked at my son. I looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of the boy I raised. I looked for the toddler who used to fall asleep on my chest. I looked for the teenager who spent his summers helping me sand the paint on an old truck in the garage. I found absolutely nothing. All I saw was the reflection of his wife's ambition. "Sit down," I said, my voice sounding rough and heavy. We sat in the living room. Elise poured the wine into 3 glasses, handing one to me. Her hand trembled slightly, a tiny tremor betraying her forced composure. "We have a compromise," Julian said, pulling a thick stack of documents from his leather briefcase. It was stapled together, covered in bright yellow sticky notes. "We want to find a middle ground. We want you to stay on as chairman emeritus. You keep the title, you keep your penthouse office, and you keep all the respect. But we need to handle the day-to-day operations. We need you to unfreeze the accounts so we can pay the drivers. Dad, you don't want to see the people who work for you suffer, right?" He was trying to use my own workers to guilt me. He knew that was my weak spot. Elise leaned forward, placing her hand on my knee. "It's just a formality," she said. "It's a limited power of attorney. It simply gives Julian the clearance to sign everyday checks and manage the bank loans, so you can finally enjoy your retirement. You deserve to rest, Arthur. You've worked hard your entire life. Let us carry the weight for you now." I looked down at the document. The title on the cover read, "Durable Medical Power of Attorney and Asset Management Proxy." I reached into my pocket for my reading glasses and slowly put them on. I took a sip of the cheap wine. It tasted like vinegar, but mostly it tasted like a lie. I opened the folder. The room went dead silent. The only sounds were the crackle of the wood burning in the fireplace and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. I could hear Julian's breath, shallow and rapid. I turned a page, reading the preamble. It was standard legal jargon. I turned another page. Elise shifted uncomfortably in her seat, crossing her legs, then uncrossing them. I read incredibly slowly. I ran my finger along every single line, acting exactly like the slow, failing old man they expected me to be. I pretended the legal terms were difficult for me to grasp. "What does this section mean?" I asked, pointing to a paragraph on the 4th page. Julian leaned in close. "That's just standard legal boilerplate, Dad. It means trustee responsibility. It just means I am required to act in your absolute best interest." I nodded, turning to the next page. I knew exactly what I was looking for. I was looking for the trap. And I found it on page 7, paragraph 12, subsection C. The text here was dense, intentionally written to make a reader lose focus and skim through it. But the words were absolute poison. It read, "The principal hereby grants the agent full authority to transfer, liquidate, or retitle any and all real property, trust accounts, and corporate equity held under the principal's name to the agent or an entity under the agent's control, for the purposes of estate planning and asset protection. This authorization is irrevocable and shall survive the principal's incapacity or passing." This wasn't a management agreement. This was outright theft. If I signed this paper, Julian could transfer the deed to this house, the title to the headquarters, and every single dollar of my personal life savings into his own name by tomorrow morning. He could legally lock me out of my own life, leaving me with absolutely no legal recourse because I had authorized it while completely lucid. I looked up. Julian was smiling. It was a tight, hungry smile. "So," I said, "you want to protect my assets?" "Yes," Elise cut in instantly. "Exactly. We want to make sure all the wealth stays securely within the family. We want to protect you from any future tax issues or liabilities. This is entirely for your own good, Arthur." I closed the document. I held it in my hand, and it felt heavy. It felt like a loaded weapon. "You know," I said, "I remember the day you were born, Julian. It was 1992, and I was out pouring a concrete foundation for a new warehouse on the south side. Your mother called me, and I didn't even turn off the mixer. I ran straight to the hospital with mud all over my boots. I held you in my arms, and I promised God I would build a life where you would never have to struggle in the dirt the way I did." Julian's smile faltered. "Dad, come on." "I built your entire world," I continued. "The elite schools, the sports cars, the vice president title. I handed it all to you on a silver platter, and your gratitude is walking into my house, drinking my wine, and demanding I sign away my own execution." What are you talking about?" Julian stammered, his voice cracking. I stood up, my knees letting out a sharp pop. I walked over to the fireplace, where the flames were leaping greedily. "This isn't a management proxy," I said, my voice suddenly booming through the room. "This is a death sentence. Paragraph 12 gives you the right to take my home. It gives you the right to take my land. It gives you the right to leave me with absolutely nothing." Elise snapped up from her seat, her face turning pale instantly. "You're misunderstanding it," she shrieked. "You're not a lawyer, Arthur. You're getting confused. You're mixing things up." "I am not confused," I roared, the sound vibrating off the walls. "I might be getting older, and I might be a rugged guy who came up from under a truck chassis. But I know how to read a routing map, and I know when a deal completely stinks." I held the document directly over the open fire. "Dad, no!" Julian screamed, lunging forward. I let go. The paperwork dropped, straight onto the burning logs. The edges of the dry paper curled instantly, the bright yellow sticky notes turning black in a fraction of a second. The flames licked at the edges of the pages, mercilessly swallowing the lies and the venomous legal text. We watched it burn. We watched their perfectly orchestrated future turn completely to ash. Elise let out a strange sound, a raspy growl of pure defeat. She stared at the flames, then locked her eyes onto mine. The mask was entirely off now. The caring daughter-in-law was gone. The fragile victim from the video had vanished completely. "You stubborn old man," she screamed, her face twisting into an incredibly ugly expression. "You selfish, arrogant, stuck-in-the-mud relic. Do you honestly think you can take all this money to the grave with you? You're going to pass away soon anyway. What happens then? We were just trying to salvage what's left before you completely ruin everything with your failing mind." I looked at her entirely calm. "Get out of my house." "No!" she shouted, taking a sharp step forward, pointing her finger directly at my chest. "You owe us. Julian spent his best years waiting around for you. We earned this money. We earned this company. We have higher education. We can actually speak to Wall Street executives in proper English, and you can't. You're just a vulgar, glorified mover wearing an expensive suit. You are an absolute embarrassment to us." Julian grabbed her by the arm. "Elise, shut up!" he urged. "Don't touch me!" she snapped at him, then turned right back to spit her venom at me. "Look at you. Do you really think you're a king? You're nothing but a truck driver who got incredibly lucky, and you should have stepped down a decade ago. You are holding us back. You are dragging down the entire brand. Nobody wants to do business with a decaying dinosaur." I didn't move an inch, and I didn't even blink. Her words hung heavily in the air, carrying the deep prejudice and arrogance she had hidden for 5 solid years. She didn't just hate me because I had money. She hated me because of where I came from, lacking what she considered high-class breeding. She hated that to maintain her lavish lifestyle. She had to play nice with an old truck driver who started at the bottom. "Are you completely finished?" I asked. Elise was panting, her chest heaving rapidly. She suddenly realized exactly what she had just said. She realized that she had permanently welded this door shut. Julian looked at me, looking absolutely terrified. "Dad, she didn't mean that. She's just incredibly upset." I looked at my son. He was actually still defending her. Even after she had viciously insulted his father, and even after she showed utter contempt for the very foundations of his family, he was still too weak to stand up and resist. He didn't deserve the sterling name at all. "Get out," I said again, my voice dropping incredibly low. The silence was chilling. "And take your cheap bottle of wine with you." Elise snatched her designer handbag and marched toward the door without looking back. Julian lingered for a single second. He looked at the paperwork, which had turned into dark red ash in the fireplace, and then he looked at me. "Dad, Get out," I said. He turned and followed his wife. I heard the front door slam heavily, followed by the hum of the Tesla motor activating, the tires screeching against the asphalt driveway as they sped away. I stood alone in the living room, the fire still crackling. I felt a deep, heavy sadness wash over me. It was the realization of a man who knew the empire he built would end with his generation. I could build a logistics network capable of surviving a polar vortex, but I couldn't raise a son strong enough to withstand pure greed. I walked over to the window, watching their taillights disappear into the night. 他们以为这一阶段结束了，以为我烧掉文件只是出于防守性的愤怒。他们根本不知道，我已经启动了下一步计划。明天就是发信日，到了明天，朱利安就会学到，尊重是买不来的，必须靠自己取证。而他即将付出的学费将会高昂的超乎想象。Friday morning arrived with a dead silence that was louder than any scream. In the logistics business, Friday is the only day that truly matters. This is the day when the sleepless nights and the calloused hands of the drivers are validated by a deposit notification on their phones. For 20 years, that notification always landed right at 6 in the morning. But today, 6 o'clock came and went. There was no notification, no deposit, only the freezing emptiness of a frozen corporate bank account. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the morning news. I didn't need to go to the office to know exactly what was happening. I knew the rhythm of my fleet too well. By 6:10, there would be utter confusion, with drivers refreshing their mobile banking apps, assuming it was just a network delay. By 6:30, the human resources and accounting phone lines would be overwhelmed. But nobody would be answering because I had locked down their system access as well. By 7, the confusion would turn to panic. By 8, that panic would turn into absolute fury. And fury always demands a target. Julian had made a fatal error. He thought he could hide behind a corporate email address. He thought issuing an internal memo about a temporary technical delay would keep everyone calm. But truck drivers don't care about memos. They care about action. When you take the food right out of a working man's mouth, you better be ready for the consequences. By 9 o'clock, things at the Sterling Freight headquarters were spinning completely out of control. But the true eye of the storm was brewing right outside the Gold Coast penthouse. My phone buzzed with a security alert from the private garage system at Julian's luxury building. I pulled up the camera feed, and it looked like a full siege. More than 30 heavy pickup trucks, covered in mud and snow, completely blocked the entrance to the underground garage. These weren't corporate vehicles. These belonged to the independent owner-operators, dispatchers, and dock workers who hadn't been paid. These were men who lived check to check, with mortgages due on Monday. They stood outside the iron security gates, shaking the bars violently, shouting for the money they had rightfully earned. I switched the camera view to the building lobby. I could see Julian through the glass, pacing frantically back and forth, still wearing his expensive silk pajamas. He looked exactly like a cornered animal. Elise was right behind him, her hands clutching her stomach, her face twisted in terror. She was holding her phone, likely trying to call the police, but authorities are always incredibly slow to respond to civil labor disputes. Besides, a badge can't hold back dozens of angry men who just want to feed their kids. Julian was gripping his phone as it rang nonstop. I knew he was trying to call me. He wanted me to fix it, to wave a magic wand and make the money appear out of thin air. But I'm not a magician. I'm a teacher. Today's lesson was all about accountability. You can't eat a socialite title. You can't pay rent with a brand redesign. And you have to back up your words with real value. I watched a brick fly over the gate and shatter a landscape light fixture on the driveway. Elise screamed, and Julian flinched violently. He was finally realizing that the CEO title carried a price tag he couldn't afford. He was the captain of a sinking ship, and the water was rushing in fast. I turned off the monitor. I'd seen enough. Now it was my turn to go to work. I walked out to the garage, bypassing the luxury sedan, and went straight to the 1999 Ford pickup, sitting in the furthest corner under a canvas tarp. The body was covered in dents, and the cab smelled of old diesel and stale coffee. This was the truck I drove when I landed my very first major shipping contract. I pulled off the tarp and threw 2 heavy black duffel bags onto the passenger seat. This was cash I had withdrawn from my personal savings account yesterday, money earned long before Sterling Freight even existed, completely untouched by corporate hands. I drove down to Distribution Center Number 4. It was our largest hub, a massive facility serving as the beating heart of our logistics network. When I arrived, the silence across the yard was deafening. The forklifts were parked, their engines cold. More than 200 workers were sitting on the ground, on wooden pallets, and on oil drums. Their heads were down, and the air was thick with heavy defeat and anger. They heard the sound of my truck before they ever saw it. That old diesel engine carried a distinct heavy rumble. Every single head snapped up in unison. Old Hank stood up from a stack of tires, squinting through the blowing snow. I drove the pickup right into the exact center of the yard, kicking up a cloud of snow and road salt. I threw the truck into park and shut off the engine. The heavy metal door slammed shut, the sound echoing across the open yard. I walked around to the passenger side, grabbed those 2 heavy duffel bags, and slammed them hard onto the tailgate of the pickup. That heavy thud caught everyone's attention instantly. I climbed up onto the bed of the truck, standing tall in my steel-toe work boots and my old plaid flannel shirt. I looked out at them. I looked at Big Marcus, who had 3 daughters in college. I looked at Miguel, whose wife was going through chemotherapy. And I looked at young Jenkins, the loader who was saving up for an engagement ring. They looked right back at me. They didn't see some pushed-out, retired old man. They saw the man who had personally given them their livelihoods. "Julian Sterling says there's a system malfunction," I shouted, my voice booming through the freezing air without needing a megaphone. "Julian Sterling says the bank is moving slow. Julian Sterling says you all just have to wait." I paused, watching the anger flash in their eyes at the mention of my son's name. "But I am not Julian Sterling," I kept roaring. "I don't hide out in a luxury penthouse. I don't pay people with automated emails. I pay people with cash." I unzipped the first duffel bag, reached in, and pulled out a massive stack of thick envelopes. Every single one had a name written on it. I started calling them out. "Old Hank." Hank stepped forward. He looked up at me, then down at the envelope. He took it and tore open the seal. Inside was pure cash, his full weekly pay plus a solid bonus for the trouble. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Hank said, his voice cracking a bit. I didn't stop. "Marcus King, Miguel Rodriguez, Samuel Chin." They lined up one by one. It felt like a solemn ceremony. My hands smelled of banking ink and the biting winter wind. I looked into every man's eyes, and I shook every single hand. I could feel the heavy calluses, and I could feel the genuine gratitude. This was the kind of hard currency a woman like Elise would never understand. You can't buy loyalty, you can only build it, brick by brick, cent by cent, over a lifetime. By the time those duffel bags were empty, the entire atmosphere of the yard had completely shifted. The heavy defeat was totally gone, replaced by a fierce, intensely loyal, protective energy. I stood on that tailgate one last time. "The company accounts are frozen," I announced, "and they are going to stay frozen. Sterling Freight is dead. That name is finished." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, but I raised my voice, cutting right through the freezing wind. "I am picking up a brand new shipping account this Monday. It's a private contract, my own project. I need a fleet. I need men who actually know how to get a job done. I don't have a fancy human resources department, and I don't have some corporate public relations team, but I have the capital, and I have the work." I looked around the entire yard. "Who's coming with me?" It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Hank didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his official Sterling Freight employee ID badge. He took one look at it, then threw it flat into the slush and snow. "I'm with Arthur," he said. Next, Marcus threw his badge down, then Miguel. Right after that, it became a literal downpour of plastic cards. More than 200 ID badges slammed into the ground, making a sharp, cracking sound against the frozen earth. That was the sound of a corporate empire collapsing. That was the sound of a working-class revolution. They weren't just quitting. They were staging a mass defection. They walked away from all the empty corporate healthcare packages and stock option promises Julian used to string them along. They chose the old man standing on the back of a rusty pickup truck. I got back into the driver's seat. I watched them pack up their tools and thermoses. They were all smiling, already calling their wives to let them know the mortgage was covered. I picked up my phone to send one final text. I took a photo of that massive pile of corporate ID badges lying in the dirty snow and sent it straight to Julian. Then I typed out a few words. "You are a general with no army." I started the pickup and drove out of the yard, leaving that pile of plastic junk behind in the dirt. It was garbage, just like all the empty promises my son had made. He was technically still the CEO of Sterling Freight, but Sterling Freight was now nothing more than a name on a piece of paper. He had the title, but I had taken the entire lifeline. Without the people who actually did the heavy lifting, he was absolutely nothing. Just a lonely guy standing in an empty room, waiting for a phone that would never ring again. The Great Migration had begun, and he was left completely stranded out in the cold. The process server arrived at my front door on a Tuesday morning. He was a young guy with nervous sweat breaking out across his lip. He knew exactly who I was. In the Chicago business community, everyone knew Arthur Sterling. He also knew he was about to hand a massive lawsuit to a legendary industry titan. He slid the thick manila envelope through the bars of the iron gate, then ran back to his car like he had just provoked a sleeping bear. I walked down the driveway and picked up the envelope. It was heavy, feeling almost like a brick. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside, but I sat down on the porch anyway, tearing into the legal complaint filed by my own flesh and blood. Julian Sterling versus Arthur Sterling. The allegations were highly creative. Breach of fiduciary duty, intentional infliction of emotional distress, tortious interference with business operations, and unlawful disruption of commercial relationships. My son was suing me because I stopped him from stealing my life's work. He was suing me because I protected the assets I spent 40 years building. But the true intent of the lawsuit was hidden back on page 15. It was an emergency motion demanding the court force the immediate release of assets from the Sterling Family Trust. Julian was completely cornered. He had no salary and no credit line. His wife was spending money she didn't have on $500 an hour attorneys. He desperately needed cash, and he needed it right now. He thought the family trust was his personal piggy bank. He thought it was his birthright. He thought that just because his last name was Sterling, he automatically controlled my wallet. He was wrong. I called Russo and told him to schedule a deposition. I told him to get Julian and his shark of an attorney into the conference room, and I told him to go into the safe and pull out the original trust agreement, the old document with the yellowing pages and the permanent ink from 1998. The meeting took place 2 days later. The conference room at Russo's law firm was freezing, with the air conditioning intentionally dialed down to 60 degrees. It was a classic psychological tactic Russo used to make opponents uncomfortable, and it was working perfectly. When Julian walked in, he was wearing a suit that now looked noticeably too big for him. The sheer pressure of the past week had clearly taken a toll. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Elise was right beside him, looking fiercely angry. It was blindingly obvious she was the real driving force behind this lawsuit. I could see it in the way she kept whispering into Julian's ear, pushing him to fight his own father. They sat on one side of the massive mahogany table. I sat on the other side, completely alone. Russo stood at the head of the table. "Let's make this brief," Julian's attorney began. His name was Bradley, and he was notorious for being aggressive and relentless. "Due to Mr. Sterling's vindictive actions, my client is experiencing extreme and unreasonable financial hardship. We demand the immediate unfreezing of the trust distributions. Julian is the sole beneficiary. This is his money, and you have no legal authority to withhold it." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my hands over my chest, just looking at Julian. "Is that really what you think?" I asked him. "You honestly believe that's your money?" "It is my money," Julian snapped back. "My mother set that up for me before she passed. It was for my future. You're just angry because the board removed you, and now you're maliciously trying to freeze me out." I looked at him with a sense of pity. He truly knew absolutely nothing. He had never taken the time to actually read the paperwork. The only thing he ever did was cash the checks. Russo cleared his throat, placing a heavy leather binder onto the table. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. "Mr. Bradley," Russo said, his voice entirely calm, "while Julian is indeed the designated beneficiary of the Sterling Family Trust, you seem to have completely overlooked the prerequisites for distribution, specifically Section 9. Bradley frowned, opening a digital copy of the documents on his tablet. "I don't see any Section 9 here." "That's because you are looking at the condensed summary provided to the banks," Russo countered. This is the original trust deed that governs all sub-accounts and underlying assets. Russo opened the binder, turning the pages with an agonizingly slow deliberation. He found the page he was looking for and smoothed it down flat. Section 9, Russo read aloud, the moral and hostile conduct clause. Elise shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her jaw tight. What on earth is that supposed to mean? She muttered. Russo continued reading without looking up. The grantor, Arthur Sterling, retains the ultimate authority to revoke, suspend, or permanently terminate all rights of the beneficiary, should the beneficiary engage in any conduct that brings public embarrassment, disrepute, or material harm to the Sterling family name. Furthermore, any legal aggression, personal intimidation, or public defamation initiated against the grantor shall serve as an immediate trigger for the permanent forfeiture of all trust benefits. The room went completely dead silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Bradley stared at the document, scanning the text rapidly, his face turning completely pale. This is completely outdated, he stammered. A clause like this wouldn't stand up in a modern courtroom. You can't legally define disrepute. It's entirely subjective. Russo smiled, the expression of a predator closing in. Actually, in this case, it's incredibly objective, Russo said, picking up a remote control and pointing it at the wall monitor. Elise's live stream video began to play on the screen. There she was, broadcasting to the public, calling me an unstable old relic, accusing me of financial and emotional abuse, dragging the name Sterling through the mud for the sake of views and online attention. Russo paused the video, then immediately pulled up the security footage from the headquarters lobby. The clip showed Julian hysterically screaming at old Hank, furiously kicking the reinforced glass doors. Russo turned off the display. Public defamation, Russo said coldly, and legal aggression. Julian, you sued your father. You filed a public court document accusing him of corporate sabotage. That is a matter of public record for anyone to see. The exact second your signature went on to that complaint, you personally triggered the forfeiture clause. Julian stared at me, his mouth open wide. But that means... It means the vault is permanently locked, I said softly. It means the tap has been turned off forever. Julian slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. You can't do this. That's tens of millions of dollars. That is my entire life. That was your life, I corrected him. Now it's a charitable foundation. I am redirecting the entirety of these assets to vocational trade schools and veterans assistance programs across the Chicago area. Elise stood up, her entire body shaking with rage. You're lying, she shrieked. You're just trying to scare us. We will fight this. We will take this all the way to the Supreme Court. You are welcome to try, Russo replied calmly. But while you spend years in court, there is a reality regarding the underlying assets held by the trust that you probably need to understand. Russo turned another page. You see, Julian, Russo said, his voice dropping into a conversational, deadly calm. You made one fatal mistake when you were building your lavish lifestyle. You were so busy trying to dodge taxes and protect yourself from potential liability that you never bought a single hard asset in your own name. You put every ounce of the titles and deeds under the trust. Julian's eyes grew wider, tracking Russo's every movement. That Gold Coast penthouse, Russo read from a neatly typed log. Deed holder, Sterling Family Trust, LLC. That Tesla model, registered owner, Sterling Family Trust. Your little winter cabin in Aspen, deed holder, Sterling Family Trust. Even that $100,000 imported Italian leather sofa in your living room, bought with trust funds, logged into the asset registry. I watched reality hit Julian square in the face like a physical blow. For a split second, he completely stopped breathing. Since you are no longer a lawful beneficiary, Russo said, closing the binder with a decisive thud, your current legal status on those properties is simply an unlawful occupant. You are driving a car you don't own, and you're sleeping in a home you have no right to. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. I'm giving you 24 hours, I said, my back to them. 24 hours? For what? Julian whispered, his voice completely broken. To clear out, I replied. I've already hired a security crew to change the locks by noon tomorrow. Leave the keys to the vehicle on the kitchen island. Leave the furniture exactly where it is. Take nothing but your clothes and your personal belongings. If you try to take a single asset out of that building, I'll have the police arrest you for grand larceny. Dad, please, Julian crumbled, stepping forward and reaching his hands out in desperation. Dad, you can't do this to us. Where are we supposed to go? We don't have a penny to our names. I turned around slowly to face him, looking at his pristine, unblemished hands and the expensive fabric of his suit. You have an Ivy League MBA, I told him. You have a flawless resume. Go out there and find a job. Elise stared at me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated venom. She snatched her designer handbag off the table with a violent jerk. Come on, Julian, she spat, her jaw tight. We're leaving. We don't need him. We'll find a way. But Julian couldn't move. He kept his eyes locked on the table, staring at the leather binder that held the multi-million-dollar empire he had just lost. It finally hit him. He wasn't a corporate titan. He wasn't even a millionaire. He was just a guy in a borrowed suit who was about to be out on the street. Give me the wallet, I said. What? Julian blinked, totally spaced out. Your wallet, I repeated. The corporate Amex, the premium fuel cards, they're all tied directly to the trust accounts. Hand them over. Julian reached into his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently that the wallet slipped through his fingers and hit the floor. He scrambled to pick it up, sliding out the cards one by one, the symbols of his status, the keys to his kingdom. He dropped them onto the mahogany table, making a hollow plastic tapping sound. I reached onto Russo's desk, picked up a heavy pair of shears, and cut them clean down the middle. Snap, snap, snap. The sound carried the weight of a final verdict. There, now you're free, I said. Isn't this what you wanted? To be an independent, self-made man? To build your own legacy? Go build it. Start from absolute zero, just like I did. Julian stared down at the pieces of shredded plastic, then looked up at me. His eyes were pooling with actual tears this time, not the rehearsed crocodile tears meant for a camera, but the heavy, desperate tears of a man staring straight into an abyss. He turned around and dragged his feet out of the office. Elise marched right behind him, the sharp click of her high heels echoing angrily down the corridor. I stood there in the quiet office. I felt old, and I felt incredibly tired, but more than anything, I felt clean. I had personally cut the rot away from the family tree. It hurt like hell, but it had to be done. Russo looked at me from across the desk. This time, he didn't offer to pour a drink. He knew there was nothing to celebrate. He's going to hold this against you for the rest of his life, Arthur, Russo said softly. I know, I replied, but at least he'll have a life to live. If I let him keep that money, it would have destroyed him. Now he has to learn how to survive. I walked back over to the table, swept the broken pieces of plastic into the trash, and checked my watch. It was noon. I had a meeting with my new fleet operators, and we had a brand new shipping network to coordinate. Life keeps moving. The diesel engines don't stop running for grief, and neither do I. The kid had exactly 24 hours to learn how to be a man. The clock was ticking. 3 days of absolute silence followed the afternoon I cut those cards. The brick house in Oak Park was dead quiet, but I knew it was just the heavy, suffocating calm before a hurricane changes direction. I spent my mornings clearing the fresh snow from the driveway and my afternoons reviewing blueprints for a brand new youth vocational center on the south side, funded entirely by the capital Julian used to waste. I was waiting. I knew that desperation is an incredibly powerful fuel, and my son's tank was completely empty. On the fourth morning, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the hesitant knock of a stranger. It was the aggressive, rapid demand of someone who thought they had every right to break down the door. I opened it. Julian and Elise were standing on the porch, and the speed of their physical collapse was shocking. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by wrinkled, ordinary streetwear. Julian looked completely run ragged, his eyes bloodshot and his face covered in a few days of uneven stubble. But Elise looked completely different. She didn't have the broken posture of a loser. She looked dangerous. There was a frantic, wild energy radiating off her that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She held a large yellow manila envelope tightly against her chest like a shield. "We need to talk," Elise said, her voice unnervingly steady. I stepped back and let them inside, leading them to the kitchen. I didn't offer them coffee. I just leaned back against the granite countertop, crossing my arms. "What do you want?" I asked. "The eviction order stands. You still have 48 hours to vacate the Gold Coast property." Julian collapsed onto a bar stool, burying his face in his hands. "Dad, please. We're drowning out here. The power's getting shut off tomorrow. They repossessed the Tesla this morning. We had to take an Uber just to get here. We have absolutely nothing left." "You made your bed," I said quietly. "You chose to bite the hand that fed you. Now you have to learn how to hunt for yourselves." Elise stepped forward, slamming the manila envelope down onto the granite counter with a force that echoed through the kitchen. "We are not here to beg you for scraps, Arthur," she said, her blue eyes turning icy cold. "We are here to give you a chance to make things right, to salvage your own soul before you end up old and alone." I looked down at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What is that?" I asked. Elise reached in and pulled out a glossy black and white printout. The image was grainy and a little blurred, but the layout was unmistakable. It was an ultrasound scan. "I'm pregnant," she announced. The words hung heavily in the air. Julian lifted his head from his hands, his face a total blur of hope and absolute terror. He stared at me, searching for any kind of reaction. Elise slid the photo closer to me. 10 weeks, she said. "This is your grandchild, Arthur. This is the future of the Sterling bloodline. This is the baby you're trying to starve out." I looked at the image, tracking the tiny gray dot that represented a heartbeat. For a fraction of a second, I felt a familiar tug in my chest, the biological urge to protect your own, the human desire to see your line continue. Elise caught the brief hesitation in my eyes, and a small, triumphant smile touched her lips. "You can't be this cruel to an innocent baby," she said, her voice softening into something sweet and manipulative. "You can hate me. You can punish Julian. But this is an innocent life. Do you really want your grandchild born in a shelter? Do you want the whole world to know that the great Arthur Sterling sat on a mountain of cash, while his own flesh and blood suffered?" Julian stood up, walking over to place his hand on Elise's shoulder. "Dad," he said, his voice husky, "this changes things, doesn't it? We have to think about the family now." I looked at the two of them standing side by side in the morning light, the picture-perfect image of expectant young parents, victims of an unyielding patriarch. But I'm a transport guy. To run a logistics empire, you have to have an absolute flawless grasp of tracking, timelines, and mileage logic. I looked back down at the ultrasound printout. I picked it up, pulled out my reading glasses, and checked the medical data stamped into the upper corner of the scan. Gestational age, 10 weeks, 2 days. Estimated due date, July 15th. I ran the math in my head. 10 weeks ago put the date right in the middle of October. My mind went back to October. I remembered October vividly because that was the month Julian had convinced the board to send him out to Silicon Valley. He claimed he needed a 6-week deep dive tech incubator, insisting on face-to-face sessions with the top AI developers in San Francisco to restructure our freight software. He left on October 1st, and he didn't return to Chicago until mid-November. For 6 solid weeks, he was 2,000 miles away. I looked up from the paper and locked eyes with Julian. I remembered the video calls he made from Palo Alto. I remembered him complaining about the California sun. I remembered the Pacific Standard timestamps on his emails. During the exact week of conception, my son was halfway across the country. I looked over at Elise. I remembered exactly where she was back in October. She had stayed behind in Chicago before heading out to Aspen, Colorado. She claimed she didn't want to go on a West Coast business trip, insisting she needed to unwind in the mountains, do her yoga, and focus on her lifestyle brand research. I remembered the jaw-dropping credit card statements from that month. High-end steakhouse dinners, late-night car service fees, and astronomical bills from the street. Regis Aspen Resort. The math didn't add up, and the geography made absolutely no sense. I set the printout down and took off my reading glasses, locking my eyes onto Elise. She was still wearing that triumphant smile. She thought she had won, treating biology like a wild card she could play without anyone ever checking her hand. "Congratulations," I said, my voice completely flat. Julian let out a massive sigh of relief, releasing the breath he had been holding in his chest. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you so much. I knew you would do the right thing." "So," Elise said, extending her hand across the counter, "we need to unfreeze the accounts today. We need to book appointments with the top obstetricians, and we need to start designing the nursery. Stress is incredibly bad for a pregnancy, Arthur. You need to put everything back the way it was right now." I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said. "A child shouldn't pay for the choices of the parents. If that baby is truly a sterling, that child deserves the world." "What exactly do you mean by if?" The smile on Elise's face vanished instantly. I walked over to the calendar hanging on the refrigerator and pointed directly to the block of days in October. "Julian," I said, "do you remember October?" "Yeah," Julian replied, looking completely confused. "I was out in Silicon Valley at the tech incubator." "You were gone for 6 solid weeks," I said. "You left on the 1st and didn't come back to Chicago until mid-November." Julian nodded. "Yeah, so what?" I pointed back to the ultrasound photo. "That scan shows a 10-week fetus. That means conception happened right in the middle of your trip to California. Unless you managed to secretly fly back here on a stealth private jet I didn't pay for, you were 2,000 miles away when your wife became pregnant." The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator compressor. Julian stared at the calendar, then slowly turned his head to look at Elise. His brow furrowed as his brain desperately tried to process the numbers. He was trying to force 2 puzzle pieces together, but they were clearly from entirely different boxes. Every drop of color drained from Elise's face, turning her from flush red to a ghostly pale white. That's just an estimate," she stammered. "Doctors get the dates wrong all the time. It could be 9 weeks, or it could be 11. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." "Maybe," I said. "Biology can be complicated, but numbers are very simple." I walked back to the counter, staring directly into Elise's eyes. "Here's my offer," I said. "I can set up a brand new trust fund today. I will deposit $2 million in cash immediately to cover the finest medical expenses, housing, and future education. I will buy you 2 a new house, and I will reinstate Julian's salary." Julian's eyes lit up. "Dad, seriously?" But I raised a single finger, cutting him off. "On one condition." "Anything," Julian said eagerly. "We can sign the paperwork right now. Not tomorrow. Right now. We go straight to the clinic for a non-invasive prenatal paternity test," I said. "It's a simple blood draw from the mother, completely safe for the pregnancy, 99.9% accurate, and we'll have the results in 48 hours. I picked up my truck keys. "If the DNA match proves the child is Julian's, I will give you the entire kingdom back. I will issue a formal apology, pack up my fishing gear, and let you 2 run everything." I kept my gaze fixed on Elise. "But if the DNA doesn't match, you don't get a single cent. And you, Elise, will pack your things, leave my house, and vanish from my son's life forever." Julian turned to Elise, his face filled with genuine hope. "Honey, this is perfect," he said. "It's just a simple blood test. Let's go. We can prove it to him and get our whole life back right now." Elise didn't move an inch. She stared back at me with a look of pure, burning hatred. She knew. She knew I had uncovered the truth, and she knew that science was about to tear down her final lie. "No," she hissed. "What?" Julian blinked, completely blindsided. "I said no!" Elise screamed, taking a sharp step back from the island. "I'm not letting you stick needles in me. I'm not letting your sick paranoia endanger my baby. This is an insult. How dare you question me? I am his legal wife. It's just a blood draw, Elise." Julian's voice started to crack and tremble. "It's completely safe. Dad said he'd give us $2 million. Why won't you just go?" "Because he's setting a trap for us," she roared, completely losing her composure now, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. "He'll tamper with the results. He has the money to buy off anyone. I don't trust him." "I don't control independent laboratories, Elise," I said calmly, "and I don't control the truth. Elise lunged forward, grabbing Julian's arm and digging her nails deep into his skin. "We're leaving, Julian. Right now. He's insane. He's trying to hurt our baby. Come with me." She pulled against him, trying to drag him toward the door. But Julian resisted. His feet stayed completely planted on the floor. He stared at his wife, then looked back at the calendar on the fridge, and finally turned his gaze to me. For the first time in his 32 years, I could see the gears in his head actually turning. The blind devotion was cracking, and suspicion was rushing into his mind like water into a bursting basement. "Baugo," Julian asked softly, his voice trembling. "If the baby is mine, why are you terrified to take the test?" Elise swung her hand back and slapped him across the face. The sharp, venomous sound cracked through the kitchen. "Don't you dare start questioning me," she hissed like a viper. "You're taking his side? If you love me, you walk out that door with me right now. If you stay here and ask these questions, we are completely finished." She spun on her heels, sprinting out of the kitchen and down the hallway, slamming the heavy front door behind her. Julian stood exactly where he was, one side of his face bright red. He stared at the empty doorway, then looked down at the ultrasound photo on the counter. He picked it up, his eyes fixated on the date stamped in the corner. October. He looked up at me, his eyes completely overflowing with tears. But these weren't the tears of a spoiled child being denied what he wanted. These were the heavy, crushing tears of a man who had just taken a knife straight to the chest. "She lied to me," he whispered. I walked over and placed a heavy, firm hand on his shoulder. "I can't give you all the answers, son," I said. "Biao da fang sure. But a woman telling the truth doesn't run away from a needle." Julian completely broke. He slid down the side of the cabinets onto the floor, burying his face in his hands as he sobbed uncontrollably. He was weeping for a child that wasn't his, for a marriage built entirely on a scam, and for the years he had wasted trying to please a woman who only viewed him as a walking bank account. I stood over him, offering no soft words or easy comfort. I let him feel the full weight of the pain. Pain is a teacher. Pain is the fire that burns away weakness. I walked to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and handed it down to him. "Drink this," I said. "You've got a long road ahead of you." Julian looked up, his face stained with tears. "What do I do now, Dad?" "First, you stop crying," I told him. "Then you start doing the math. Count up the days she lied to you and look at the money she took from you. After that, you decide for yourself whether you want to spend the rest of your life as a victim or if you want to be a man who carries the name Sterling." He took the water, swallowed it down, and wiped his face hard. The expression in his eyes completely shifted. The weakness vanished, replaced by something much harder and colder. "I want the test done," he said, his jaw setting. "She won't agree to it," I replied. "Then I'll wait until the baby is born," Julian muttered through clenched teeth. "And if that child isn't mine, I am going to dismantle her world entirely." I nodded slowly. "That's the right answer," I said. The pregnancy wildcard had been played, and it had failed spectacularly. Elise had completely overestimated her leverage. She thought a baby would bind us to her terms forever, but instead she had personally handed Julian the shears to cut the final cord. The war was entering its final phase, and my son was finally ready to stand his ground. Back at a run-down motel on the edge of the city, Elise wasn't weeping like a desperate wife. She was plotting. She sat in the dim light of the room, looking over a desk cluttered with unpaid bills and the last few pieces of designer jewelry she had managed to keep. She knew Julian was a sinking ship, and Elise was absolutely not the type of woman to go down with the captain. She was a predator, the kind who steals the only lifeboat, rowing away while watching everyone else go under. She pulled Julian's laptop out of her bag, the one piece of tech she had smuggled out of the penthouse. The battery icon showed only 10% remaining. That was more than enough. She knew the password. It was her birthday. Of course it was. Julian focused on emotion while Elise focused on strategy. She logged into the system, bypassing family photos and personal correspondence, navigating directly to an encrypted folder labeled Master Database. That file was the absolute holy grail of the Great Lakes logistics industry, the complete client registry and proprietary routing algorithms. It wasn't just a list of names. It held the direct personal contacts, historical bidding baselines, bottom line profit margins, and private numbers for the coordinators inside the Chicago Transit authorities. It represented 40 years of handshakes and flawless credibility. In the right hands, that data was worth millions. Elise pulled a flash drive from her purse. Her hand shook slightly as she plugged it into the port, driven not by guilt, but by a massive rush of adrenaline. She dragged the folder over to the drive. The blue progress bar crawled across the screen, copying over 25,000 proprietary files. She watched the bar fill to the edge, a cold smile spreading across her lips. This was her exit strategy. She was going to sell this database to my primary competitor, Gavin Thorpe, the owner of Martin Logistics out of Detroit. Gavin was a wealthy, ruthless man who had spent a decade trying to crack my shipping network. Elise knew he would pay an astronomical amount of cash for this data, enough for her to buy a luxury condo in Miami and hire a top-tier divorce lawyer to strip Julian of everything he had left. The transfer finished. She pulled the drive and shut the laptop. Leaving the motel room, she got into her car, which she had parked 2 blocks away to avoid the repossession company. She started the engine and began driving through the night toward Detroit. She honestly believed she was driving toward freedom, completely unaware that she was heading straight into a digital minefield. I was still wide awake when the alert flashed on my secure server. Access notification, unauthorized replication. Terminal ID, Julian's primary laptop. I sat up in bed, adjusting my pillows. I didn't call the police, and I didn't call Julian. I simply poured myself a glass of water and waited quietly. I had been waiting for this exact moment for 6 solid months. You see, I understood human nature far too well, and I understood Elise even better. I knew that the exact second the pressure reached a breaking point, she would immediately try to cash in on our family secrets. It was a brand of greed written into her genetic makeup. That was why 6 solid months ago I had instructed my lead IT administrator to set up a digital honeypot. We had created a clone mirror folder hidden inside Julian's laptop. To the naked eye, it looked identical to our primary database. The file names were exact, the data sizes matched perfectly, but every single metric inside was absolute poison. The personal numbers for our key accounts were redirected to adult entertainment hotlines in Las Vegas, and the email addresses were dead-end loops. We intentionally inflated our historical shipping rates by 300%. Best of all, the client notes were loaded with fabricated, highly offensive reviews, meaning anyone who actually tried to use that data would instantly face catastrophic defamation lawsuits. Elise didn't understand a single thing about the logistics industry. She couldn't tell real data from a fake setup. She just saw the file names and had dollar signs flashing in her eyes. She met Gavin Thorpe, my absolute fiercest competitor, and the owner of Martin Logistics out of Detroit, in the parking lot of a highway diner at 2 a.m. My private investigator was parked 3 rows down, capturing every single exchange through a long-distance lens. Elise handed over the flash drive, and Gavin passed her a heavy envelope containing $20,000 in cash as a deposit. He promised to deliver the remaining $80,000 the moment his team verified the authenticity of the network data. Elise took the money, running her fingers over the bills with pure greed. She smiled, probably laughing to herself about how the old man never even noticed how clever she was. Gavin drove straight back to his Detroit offices that night, completely desperate to hijack a massive automotive parts transport account we were currently bidding on. He plugged the flash drive into his corporate mainframe, opened the files, and initiated his data scraping software. And in that exact moment, the steel trap snapped completely shut. Those files weren't just useless junk data, they were embedded with high-grade digital beacons and tracking software. The exact millisecond Gavin opened them on his corporate network, a tracker pinged the servers at Russo's law firm. It logged his IP address, documented the exact time, and secured undeniable evidence that he was in possession of stolen trade secrets. But the immediate payback was even more poetic. Gavin tried calling the very first number on the VIP list, believing he was dialing the personal line of a major executive at Ford. Instead, he was greeted by a highly explicit, recorded message demanding a credit card number to access a premium adult hotline. He tried a second number only to find a dead line. When he checked our historical shipping rates, he saw a completely absurd figure of $15 per mile, a number so ridiculously high that any competitor attempting to use it to underbid us would look like an absolute amateur. Gavin finally realized he had been played for a fool. He realized he had just handed $20,000 to a desperate, bankrupt socialite for a pile of corrupted cyber junk. His face undoubtedly turned a deep, furious shade of purple. He grabbed his phone, but he didn't call me. He dialed Elise. Elise was sitting on the edge of a bed in another cheap motel room, counting her cash all over again. When she saw Gavin's name pop up, she answered with complete delight, expecting praise and the remaining $80,000. "You absolute idiot of a woman!" Gavin roared through the line, his voice so loud she had to pull the phone away from her ear. "What kind of garbage did you sell me? The data is fake. The whole thing is a joke." "What?" Elise stammered, her voice shaking. "No, that's impossible. I personally copied it from Julian's computer. That is the main database." "It was a trap, you fool," Gavin shouted back. "The phone numbers are adult hotlines. The pricing metrics are a total fabrication. Worst of all, you infected my entire corporate network with a digital tracking beacon. Arthur Sterling already knows. He knows I have the drive." Elise felt the entire room start to spin. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible. There's no way he could know." "He knows," Gavin yelled, "and I am sure as hell not taking a corporate espionage charge for someone like you. I am calling the federal authorities right now. I am telling them you approached me, attempting wire fraud with fake corporate secrets. I am turning over the flash drive. You better find yourself a defense attorney and get my 20 grand back to me immediately, or I will make sure you pay for this." The line slammed dead. Elise collapsed onto the cheap mattress, the cash in her lap suddenly feeling incredibly heavy and incredibly toxic. She stared at her phone, finally realizing she hadn't just betrayed her husband. She had walked directly into a cage I had built for her long before she ever understood the rules of the game. Back at my house, I received a text message from Russo. "The beacon is active. Thorpe's IP address is confirmed. We now have ironclad proof of both theft and the attempted sale of trade secrets. Do we proceed with federal criminal charges?" I looked at the message, picturing Elise trembling in that run-down motel room. I typed my reply. "Turn it over to the federal authorities immediately. Include the entire chain of custody. No leniency." She thought she was a predator, but she was just a moth flying straight into a furnace. Morning was coming, and the final reckoning was about to land. Meanwhile, Julian spent 3 solid days wandering the brutal winter streets of Chicago. He had been kicked out of his motel because he couldn't even manage a $30 nightly rate. Every single one of his corporate contacts and venture capital connections blocked his number, the exact second they found out he had crossed me. By 2 in the morning on the third night, a freezing rain mixed with sleet hit the city. Julian was huddled inside a glass transit shelter under a concrete overpass downtown, wearing nothing but his thin cashmere sweater, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Hunger was tearing at his stomach like a rusted blade. He hadn't eaten a single bite of food in over 36 hours. He watched the cars speed past, looking at people heading home to warm houses. He remembered the premium sushi he used to throw away and the expensive champagne he never bothered to finish. He pulled out his phone. The battery icon showed a mere 3%, and the screen had cracked days ago. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over that one familiar name, Dad. In the days prior, he had called me dozens of times. I hadn't answered once, but his pride and arrogance had been entirely washed away by the freezing rain. He finally hit dial. My phone rang. I sat in my study, watching the snow accumulate outside. I had been waiting for this call. I pressed answer. "Speak." My voice was as flat and cold as an iceberg. "Dad." Julian's voice was incredibly faint, broken by violent shivering. I could hear the howling wind and the sound of tires sloshing through freezing water in the background. "Dad, I'm so cold." I didn't say anything. I let the silence stretch across the line, forcing him to listen to the fragile echo of his own choices. "I don't have anywhere to go," Julian choked out, breaking into tears. "Elise ran off and left me with everything. The authorities took her in. I have absolutely nothing left, Dad. I'm sitting under the overpass on State Street. I'm so hungry. Dad, please, just transfer me $100. Just enough for a hot meal and a room for the night. I swear I'll pay you back." I closed my eyes. It would have been so incredibly easy to hit a button, send a few $100, and end his suffering right there. But if I did that now, he would always be a beggar with a full stomach. By tomorrow, he would still be completely useless. "No," I said. Julian let out a sharp gasp. "Dad, please, I am your son." "Because you are my son, I cannot give you money," I told him. "Money was the poison that brought you to this exact spot. It made you believe you were superior to the people who actually do the real work. If I bail you out tonight, you learn absolutely nothing." "Then what do you want me to do?" Julian cried out into the receiver. "Do you want me to freeze to death on the sidewalk?" "I want you to live," I said firmly, "but I want you to live like a real man." I stood up from my chair. "I have an opening. Tomorrow morning, 4:30 sharp, at the Southside unloading dock number 4. I need a freight loader." "A loader?" Julian blinked, stunned. "But Dad, I have an MBA. I'm an executive." "You're a homeless guy with 3% battery," I snapped, cutting him off completely. "That is your current reality. The job pays $18 an hour. You show up in work boots and gloves. You lift 80-pound freight cases into the trailers. You take orders from the foreman, and you do not complain." A suffocating silence filled the line as his ego fought a losing battle against his survival instinct. 18 an hour, he muttered in complete despair. "That won't even cover an Uber to get there." "Then you walk," I said coldly. "It's about 5 miles from where you are to the docks. If you start moving now, you'll make it by 4. That gives you 30 minutes to find a heavy pair of discarded gloves. If you are 1 minute late, the job is gone. And if you don't show up, don't ever call this number again because I will never answer it." I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking slightly. It was the hardest decision I had ever made in my 70 years. Leaving my own flesh and blood out in an ice storm felt like tearing my own heart out with my bare hands. But I knew that only the biting cold could wash away his arrogance, and only true hunger would make his mind completely sharp. I went to the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I wasn't sleeping tonight. I was going to drive down to the docks, park in the shadows, and watch the gates. I had to know if the boy I raised actually had the backbone to stand up from the wreckage of his own making. At 4:20 in the morning, the sky was pitch black, and the snow was coming down hard. A stumbling figure appeared outside the iron gates of the loading dock. It was Julian, wearing a faded high-visibility vest he must have pulled out of a commercial dumpster. The executive aura was entirely gone. He looked like a ghost wandering through a graveyard of steel. The foreman handed him a pair of thick work gloves and pointed toward a massive stack of heavy machinery parts. "Get those loaded into Trailer 3. Move it!" Julian looked at the crates, then down at his hands, which had never done anything but type on a keyboard. He bent over, gripping the rough edge of the first wooden box. "Ugh!" He let out a painful grunt. The weight was immense. He hoisted the heavy crate onto his shoulder, the rough splinters cutting right through the fabric of his gloves. By the 10th crate, he was completely drenched in sweat despite the sub-zero temperature. By the 20th crate, because he didn't understand the physical mechanics of lifting, his lower back felt like it was breaking in two. I watched from the security room down the line. I saw him slip, the crate slamming onto the concrete, kicking up a cloud of dust. He coughed, dry heaving from the sheer exhaustion. He pulled off his gloves, revealing palms that were already completely blistered and bleeding. He looked around frantically, desperate for me to appear, hoping I would step out and tell him he had passed the test. But I didn't show. He let out a low, guttural growl, pulled the gloves back over his bleeding hands, and gripped the crate again. He was crying, his tears mixing with the sweat on his face, but he didn't stop. By noon, the sharp blast of the lunch whistle cut through the air. The veteran dock workers gathered around the containers, opening hot thermoses and laughing among themselves. Julian had no food. He collapsed onto a pile of broken wooden pallets, his entire body trembling from the pain. "Hey, CEO!" Big Marcus called out, chewing on a sausage. "That freight line over there is completely crooked. How can you not even stack a box straight?" The yard erupted into a chorus of harsh, mocking laughter. "Look at his hands," another loader chuckled. "Soft as a baby's. He won't make it past 2 o'clock." Julian heard every single word, the humiliation threatening to swallow him whole. He looked toward the main gates. They were wide open. He could stand up, walk out, and quit right now. He actually stood up, swaying slightly, taking a step toward the exit. But then he stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes caught a figure working near the dispatch hub, a 70-year-old man standing right out in the freezing wind, smoothly operating a heavy forklift, setting down the heaviest oversized containers with perfect precision. It was me. I wasn't sitting in a heated office. I was out in the snow, doing the exact same heavy lifting. Julian watched me. He saw the way the veteran workers looked at me, not with mockery or contempt, but with absolute, unadulterated respect. Because I worked, they worked harder. Something finally clicked inside his mind. He realized the vast canyon between us wasn't an Ivy League degree or a corporate balance sheet. It was the willingness to bleed for the things you build. He turned around, walked back to the pallets, and sat down, turning his back to the open gates. The foreman walked over, not even looking at him, and tossed a brown paper bag into his lap. "Eat. Don't go fainting on my dock. I hate filling out incident reports." Julian opened the bag, revealing a cheap, thick-cut ham sandwich and a bottle of water. A month ago, he wouldn't have even looked at it. Now it was the most valuable thing in his world. He took a massive bite, the tears finally slowing down as he chewed. He didn't look like a king, and he didn't look like a CEO. But as he wiped the sweat and dirt from his brow and looked back at the line of heavy crates waiting for him, I knew he was finally becoming a sterling. The corporate empire was gone, but on that frozen concrete floor, the foundation of a real man was being built, and that was worth more than 40 years of gold. He lifted the sandwich with those bleeding, dirt-caked hands and took a bite. The bread was dry and the meat was salty, but he felt a warm sensation spreading through his stomach. It wasn't just calories, it was fuel. It was the very first meal of his life that he had actually earned with his own blood and sweat. The afternoon whistle blew. Julian stood up, pulling his work gloves tight over the pane, and walked back toward the next line of heavy crates. The arrogant boy who drove a Tesla was dead, buried right beneath the freezing concrete of the Chicago docks. The man climbing out of the dirt was someone I barely knew yet. But for the first time in 32 years, I actually wanted to get to know him. Winter finally gave way, and Chicago welcomed the thick, heavy heat of July. Dock number 4 was running like clockwork now. Julian wasn't that fragile boy who almost fainted lifting a single box anymore. He had leaned out, his skin burned to a deep bronze, his hands thick with heavy calluses and scars. He'd been promoted to assistant dispatch manager. It wasn't because his last name was Sterling. It was because he was the first one to arrive every single morning, and the last one to lock the gates at night. He lived in a cheap studio apartment nearby, drove a used pickup, and paid his own bills. He was building a life that actually belonged to him. But the past has a way of scratching its way back to the surface just when you think you've buried it deep enough. During lunch break that day, the workers were eating in the shade, and I was in the dispatch office reviewing the latest fuel margin reports. Suddenly, the sharp screech of tires and a piercing scream echoed from the main gate. It was Elise. She stormed onto the lot, and she looked completely altered. The designer wardrobe was entirely gone, replaced by a faded, wrinkled sundress. Her hair was a chaotic mess, her eyes frantic and wild, and she was clutching a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket tightly against her chest. She marched straight toward Julian. The workers stopped talking, and the atmosphere on the lot went instantly freezing cold. Every man there knew the kind of disaster this woman carried with her. Julian slowly stood up, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans. He didn't take a single step toward her, and there was no joy on his face, only absolute vigilance. "Look at him!" Elise stopped 3 feet short of him, thrusting the bundle forward like she was brandishing a weapon. "Look at your son, Julian. Look at what you've done to us. We are living in a filthy, run-down motel, and you're out here playing some blue-collar role-play game. Your father's sitting on a mountain of gold, and you just watch us starve." Julian looked down at the swaddle. The tiny infant was fast asleep, fragile and completely innocent. "Why are you here, Elise?" Julian's voice was calm, anchoring a depth it never had before. "I'm here for what belongs to me," she shrieked. "I gave birth to your heir, and you abandoned us. I want the money, I want back child support, and I want a house. If I don't get it, I'm going straight to the media. I will let the entire country know that Arthur Sterling is a monster who starves his own grandchild." She spun her head, spotting me standing in the doorway of the office. "There he is, the grand old patriarch." I walked down the wooden steps, my boots crunching heavily against the gravel. I didn't look at Elise. I kept my eyes on the baby. "Bring a chair out here," I told the foreman. The chair was set down. "Sit down, Elise," I said. "You're shaking so badly you're going to drop the child." "I'm not sitting. I want to check." "Sit down, or leave the property right now." My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the unyielding weight of an iron hammer. She sank into the chair, clutching the baby tight, her entire frame trembling. "You think you won?" she hissed at me through clenched teeth. "But I hold the ultimate card. This is Julian's son. You can't outrun biology, Arthur. The law will force you to pay." Julian looked at me, a brief shadow of doubt flickering across his face. He remembered the confrontation in the kitchen months ago. But looking at a real, breathing infant, any man would feel that biological urge to believe he was a father. "Is he mine, Elise?" Julian asked softly. "Of course he's yours, you idiot!" Elise snapped instantly. "Who else would he belong to? I am your wife. I was completely faithful. It was your vicious father who forced those lies into your head." I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a corporate check. It was an official laboratory report from the Illinois Medical Center. "You see, Elise," I said, taking a step closer, "you made a critical error. When you gave birth at the county hospital last week, you listed Julian as the father on the birth certificate paperwork to secure a high-value medical insurance claim. That made it a matter of public record, and since I am the primary holder paying the premium for Julian and his dependents, I have full authority to request the verified medical review logs." Elise's face went entirely bloodless. She tightened her grip on the bundle, and the baby let out a faint, waking whimper. "I authorized a paternity screen," I continued. "The samples were collected the day the child was born. It's standard anti-fraud protocol when dealing with claims from separated spouses. You had no right," she whispered, terror bleeding into her voice. "I have every right to know exactly where my money goes," I said. I unfolded the document and laid it flat on the hood of a nearby forklift. The workers moved in closer, forming a silent circle around us. They weren't spectating. They were witnessing a judgment, and the verdict was written in black ink. I read the results aloud. Tested subject, male infant. Alleged father, Julian Sterling. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. A dead, hollow silence fell over the entire yard. Julian stared at the paper, his eyes completely fixed. He didn't blink, and he didn't breathe. I kept reading. However, genetic markers indicate a 99.9% match with an existing profile in the registry database. Subject identifier, Mr. Trevor Davis. I looked over at Elise. "Trevor?" I let the name hang in the humid air. "Isn't that your private ski instructor from Aspen? The man you paid $500 a day to help you with your mountain cabin yoga sessions while Julian was 2,000 miles away in California?" Elise looked as if she had taken a physical blow to the chest. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The final leverage she relied on to secure a massive corporate payout had collapsed entirely. This is a mistake," she stammered weakly. "The lab must have switched the samples." "There is no mistake, Elise," I said, breaking her down completely. "I called Trevor this morning. When I informed him that failing to clarify the situation could result in federal conspiracy charges for insurance fraud, he cooperated immediately. He's currently working at a car wash in Colorado, and he indicated he'd be more than willing to take responsibility for his son." Julian took a step forward. He stood directly over Elise, looking down at her. For a second, I thought he would explode. I thought he would scream, kick the chair, and let the old, volatile Julian take over. But the man standing there had spent months moving heavy machinery crates. He had learned the value of restraint and composure. He looked down at the crying infant, extending a rough, calloused finger to gently touch the baby's cheek. "He's a beautiful kid," Julian said softly. Elise looked up, a desperate, toxic hope flaring in her eyes. "Julian, please, we can fix this. We can just tell everyone he's yours. Your father never has to know. Or even if he does, we can just ignore him. We can start over, Julian. I love you." Julian pulled his hand back, straightening his posture. He looked at Elise, and for the first time, there was absolutely nothing left in his gaze. No love, no hatred, no anger. There was only a vast, empty indifference. "You don't love me," Julian said. "You don't even know me. You love the black card, and now that the account is closed, you're trying to use a baby as a transaction terminal." He took a step back. "Go find Trevor," he said. "The boy needs his real father, and that man isn't me." "But Julian," Elise sobbed, completely breaking down, "I have absolutely nowhere to go." "That is no longer my concern." Julian turned his back on her, never looking back. He walked over to his cooler, took a long drink from his water jug, and pulled his dusty work gloves back over his hands. "All right, fellas," Julian shouted across the yard. "Trailer 3 is only half loaded. Let's get back to work." The workers moved instantly. The forklifts roared back to life, and the heavy thud of cargo hitting the flatbeds completely drowned out the sound of Elise's crying. She sat there stunned for a long minute, staring at the solid, unyielding back of her husband. She finally understood that he was never turning around. He was building something real now, and she had been completely erased from the blueprint. She stood up, wrapping the blanket tight around the infant. She threw one last venomous look in my direction, but didn't say a word. She knew I had won. She stumbled across the gravel lot in her high heels, carrying the crushing weight of her own choices, while trying to salvage whatever pride she had left. I watched her walk out the gate. I felt a brief sense of sorrow for the child, but I knew the boy would be looked after. I would make sure Trevor had a stable job to support a family, and I'd make sure the baby had what he needed. But Elise was going to taste the full bitterness of the harvest she had sowed. I walked over to Julian. He was checking the loading manifest, the lines on his face firm and steady. "You doing all right, son?" I asked. Julian didn't stop his pen. He signed off on the line, looked up at me, and offered a tired but completely free smile. "I'm good, Dad," he said. "Honestly, I just feel lighter, like I finally unhitched a load of scrap metal I didn't even know I was carrying around." I patted his shoulder. "Good," I said. "Keep moving. We've got a delivery deadline to hit." The parasites were gone. The poison had been drained completely. My son was a free man. For the first time since the storm began, I knew the sterling name was entirely secure. It wasn't because of the numbers in a corporate vault, but because of the steel in my son's spine. The air inside the Cook County Courthouse smelled of old floor wax and anxious waiting. I sat in the very back row of courtroom 4B. I was wearing my finest suit, but today I didn't feel like a corporate executive. I felt like a quiet observer at a funeral. Elise stood in the defense box, wearing a simple blue dress that looked like it came off a clearance rack at a discount store. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun. She looked incredibly small. The arrogance that had fueled her for years had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a shivering shell of a woman. She was about to learn that every action carries a definitive price tag. The federal prosecutor leading the charge against her was a young man who treated this case like a personal crusade. He presented the chain of custody with the precision of a surgeon, laying out the digital logs from Julian's laptop for the jury, playing the recorded audio of Elise attempting to negotiate the sale of stolen assets with Gavin Thorpe, and displaying the signature on the illicit agreement. It was a perfect trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to the abyss of her own greed. Elise's defense attorney tried his best to paint her as a victim, arguing that she was under extreme financial coercion and claiming she was just a confused young mother acting out of pure desperation. But the judge wasn't buying a single word. She was a woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen through every brand of deception a courtroom could offer. The look she directed at Elise carried zero pity, only deep, unyielding disappointment. When Elise took the stand, she began to cry. She looked past the crowd, locking her eyes onto me sitting in the very back row. Her gaze was pleading for mercy. She wanted me to stand up, wanted me to tell the judge the whole thing was just a misunderstanding, and wanted me to open my checkbook for her one last time. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my knees. I didn't look away. I gave her the final respect of watching her face her own undoing, but I was never throwing her a lifeline. The verdict came down just 2 hours later. Guilty on 2 counts of corporate espionage and 1 count of attempted wire fraud. When Elise stood to receive her sentencing, her knees buckled so violently she had to grip the defense table just to keep her balance. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Ms. Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through the room, "you attempted to destroy a legacy you had absolutely no part in building. You betrayed your family for personal gain. You have shown a complete lack of remorse, and you are merely sorry that you were caught." The penalty wasn't a direct trip to a prison cell. Prison was far too cheap for her. Prison offered 3 free meals a day and a bed. The judge handed her something much heavier. 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and full financial restitution, the judge announced. She was ordered to repay the $20,000 she took from Thorpe, cover all court costs, and pay a $50,000 criminal fine. Elise gasped for air, breaking into deep sobs. "I don't have that kind of money." "Then you will work," the judge replied coldly. "You will get a job, and the court will garnish your wages directly until every single cent is paid in full. If you miss even a single monthly payment, you will serve your time behind bars." The gavel slammed down, making a sharp, final sound that left absolutely no room for negotiation. Elise was led away by the bailiffs to be processed. She looked back one final time, but she didn't see me. She only saw the ghost of the luxury lifestyle she had personally thrown into the furnace. She was only 29 years old, a convicted felon, drowning in massive debt, and completely alone. Justice wasn't a sudden bolt of lightning from the sky. It was the slow, exhausting grind of a monthly payment plan, a constant reminder of her own greed that would follow her for the next decade of her life. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Chicago autumn sun, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. I didn't feel a sense of joy. I just felt a total sense of finality. The tumor had been successfully removed, and now it was time to see how the patient was recovering. 6 months passed. The leaves turned yellow and dropped, leaving the trees completely bare. The deep autumn season brought the busiest stretch of the year for the freight business. I parked my pickup truck outside the gates of dock number 4. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. I pulled my hard hat on and walked straight into the unloading zone. The noise was absolutely deafening. The reverse alerts of the forklifts, the high-pitched whine of pneumatic wrenches, and the shouting of dispatchers over the loudspeakers. It was a beautiful symphony of hard work. I looked around for the old foreman, but old Hank had retired the previous month, finally saving up enough money to go fishing down in Florida. I had appointed a new general yard supervisor, a man who had climbed his way up from the absolute bottom. I found him right by the loading platform. Julian was holding a clipboard, locked in a fierce argument with a supplier's truck driver who was trying to offload a shipment of substandard pallets.